1930s, narrated by William Bishop, presented by William Bishop, and produced by William Bishop. We'll start off with some top movies of the 1930s, which included Gone with the Wind, starring Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable; Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a Disney production, starring Adriana Caselotti as the voice of Snow White; Frankenstein, starring Colin Clive as the monster himself; The Wizard of Oz, starring Judy Garland as Dorothy, Ray Bolger as the Scarecrow, Jack Haley as the Tin Man, and Bert Lahr as the Cowardly Lion. Also, there was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, starring James Stewart, also known as Jimmy Stewart. The 1930s knew several famous musicians as well, including Glenn Miller, Louis Armstrong, Frank Sinatra, and Billie Holiday. Some of the top books of the 1930s included The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. The fashion of the 1930s included three-piece suits for men, and long skirts and jackets for women, and hats for both sexes. The 1930s knew two presidents: Herbert Hoover, who served from 1929 to 1933 with his VP Charles Curtis, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who served from 1933 to 1945, knowing several VPs, including John Garner, Henry Wallace, and Harry S. Truman. Some of the major events of the 1930s included the Hoover-Stimson Doctrine, which stated that the U.S. would not recognize any international territory seizures that were taken by force. Bonus Army marching on the Washington, which was World War I vets marching on Washington, D.C., wanting bonuses for serving in the military. And, of course, there was also Roosevelt's New Deal, which was focusing on relief, reform, and recovery of the U.S. economy. The 1930s also had a few amendments to the Constitution, including the 20th Amendment, which moved the beginning and ending dates of the legislative and executive branch members' terms, and the 21st Amendment, one of the most popular amendments, which ended the U.S. prohibition against alcohol. And, of course, there was also the Glass-Steagall Act, which gave the president control over bank transactions and foreign exchanges. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which was designed to raise American exports and lower tariffs. The Neutrality Acts, which were guidelines put in place for the U.S. in case a foreign war broke out. And then there was Cash and Carry, which allowed the Allies to purchase weapons from the U.S. without violating the U.S.'s neutrality in World War II. Also, the FBI was established under J. Edgar Hoover. Some of the scandals of the 1930s included the Teapot Dome scandal. Secretary of the Interior sold the rights to naval oil reserves to private corporations. And, of course, Charles R. Forbes, who swindled over $200 million from the government. Some world events included the Hindenburg event and that nasty little spat called World War II. Some civil rights movements included the Japanese American Citizenship League, which was meant to protect Japanese immigrants' rights during and after World War II. Some Supreme Court cases that happened were Powell v. Alabama, which was the first time the Supreme Court ever overturned a state conviction due to a lack of counsel for the defense, and the DeJong v. Oregon trial, which solidified the 14th Amendment. The Great Depression was at its height during this time, so the economy was at its lowest. The Dust Bowl was also hitting the Midwest, but, of course, Roosevelt's New Deal was meant to help end the Great Depression. The average life expectancy of an American at this time was about 60 years. A car cost about $700, but gas was only 10 cents. Income per year went from $1,900 in the early years of the 30s to $1,700 in the later years. A house cost anywhere between $7,000 and $10,000. It's time for a quiz. Whenever I say a question, I'll wait a few seconds and then I'll move on. Question 1. Name one of the presidents that served a term in the 1930s. And go. All right, got your answer? Let's move on. Question 2. When was the book Brave New World published? I'll give you some time now. All right, got your answer? Let's move on. Question 3. Who is the man who sang New York, New York? Was it A, Bob, B, George Washington, C, Frank Sinatra, or D, Billie Holiday? All right, got your answer? Let's move on. Question 4. What did the Japanese American Citizenship League do? All right, got your answer? Let's move on. Question 5. How much was gas in the 1930s? All right, got your answer? Let's move on. Who ran the FBI when it was first established? All right, got your answer? Let's move on. Question 7. The 21st Amendment ended what? All right, got your answer? Let's move on. Chapter 8. Who starred in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? All right, got your answer? Let's move on. Question 9. This man's VP was Charles Curtis. All right, got your answer? Let's move on. Who played La Vie en Rose? Thank you for listening. This has been a William Bishop production.